Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Menil Collection. My name is Mary Magsamen, and I am the manager of public programs here. We're very happy to have you here for tonight's program. Next Thursday, we will be having a program at the Menil Drawing Institute with Michelle Donnelly. She's the Menil Drawing Institute pre-doctoral fellow, and she'll be delivering a talk titled Stamped, Rubbed, Imprinted, Drawing and Impressions of Place. So we invite you to join us for that as well. As we begin our program tonight, I kindly ask you to silence your cell phones. We're thrilled to have with us two distinguished guests tonight who will be discussing the work of Janet Sobel and the exhibition Janet Sobel All Over. First, let me introduce Natalie Dupêcher. She's the associate curator here at the Menil and the curator of the exhibition. Second is Tyler Green. He's the host of the Modern Art Notes podcast. Tyler is an award-winning historian, critic, and author, and he's been producing and hosting the podcast since 2011. He's the author of Carleton Watkins, Making the West American, which won a 2019 California Book Award Gold Medal, and Emerson's Nature and the Artists. Green's next book, titled Claiming Yosemite, the Civil War, the California Genocide, and the Invention of National Parks, is planned for 2026. He's also the co-founder and director of the Darkwater Project, which creates an anti-racist art history by revealing and interrogating historical American art's role in the construction of white supremacy. Tonight, we have the privilege of listening to Natalie and Tyler discuss the work of Janet Sobel and the exhibition Janet Sobel All Over. This conversation will be recorded live and posted at a later date on the podcast. Please join me in welcoming Natalie and Tyler in discussion of Janet Sobel.
Hello, thanks everybody for coming. The later date at which this will post on the podcast is next Thursday. This week's show, which goes up in 54 minutes, is a Memorial Day weekend clips show with Teresita Fernandez. And the week after this one will be Jess Fan, who's up in the Whitney Biennial right now. If you don't know the Modern Art Notes podcast, you can download it for free in your podcatcher, whatever that is. We have images that will be cycling behind us as we talk. So the way it works on the podcast is we do on the show page at manpodcast.com. Listeners in Cincinnati can go to the show page and see images from that week's show. You will be able to do that in 7 days. In the meantime, we have this back here. After Natalie and I talk, we will take questions. So be thinking of them. Anything I'm forgetting that we should start with? Good. Then here we go. Welcome back. Natalie Dupêcher, welcome to the Modern Art Notes podcast.
Great to be here.
Normally, my first question to a guest is about perhaps the most important thing about an artist. In this case, my first question is to get something out of the way so that we can talk about the art. Is it possible to have a conversation about, to understand Janet Sobel's achievement without discussing the preening and extraordinary sexism of the 1950s New York art world?
Well, I certainly hope we can. I think that that's a crucial part of understanding why we all don't know Janet Sobel's name. It's a crucial part of sort of understanding the history of how it came to be that this major modern artist who had a admittedly short-lived but nonetheless quite meteoric, explosive career in the mid-40s and had these solo shows and was championed by Peggy Guggenheim and reviewed and had paintings acquired by museums. And then it all kind of, in a sense, seems to fall away just a few years later. I mean, certainly the answer to that happens in the way that the narrative of abstract expressionism comes to be written and crystallized in the 1950s and beyond, where there's a certain narrative of American abstract expressionism that is put forward and comes to be favored. The art historian Anne Eden Gibson has this great line that as basically that narrative is written in the 1950s, Janet Sobel didn't pass through the masculinist sieve of art history at that time. So while I think that's a key part, like I say, of understanding the context for her reception history, I'm looking forward to talking more about the art itself too.
It's amazing how quickly the history of New York ABEX ossified.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
So let's start with a bit of Janet Sobel biography. Where was she from? How did she get to New York?
Janet Sobel was born in 1893 in Ukraine and came over to New York with her mother and two brothers sometime around 1906, 1908, after her father was killed in a pogrom in Ukraine. She marries Max Sobel relatively young, and they go on to have 5 children. By the time she starts to make art in 1940, she has the 5 kids, she has a number of grandchildren running around, and has never attended art school. She is a self-taught artist who begins to make art. I mean, there's sort of stories that we can delve into and maybe will, but that starts to make art when she's almost 50, and very rapidly is included in traveling shows that go all around the United States and eventually in a major solo show in 1944. So it all happens very quickly. And I will say too, in that brief span of years from like first artwork, which we can say circa 1940, to first solo show in 1944, her art also undergoes this incredible stylistic evolution, which is quite remarkable, I think, for any artist, but especially one who is self-taught like her, that she cycles so quickly into creating these amazing, in many cases, large scale and very formally and materially adventurous all over abstract paintings.
Let's start around 1940.
Okay.
What is she making, and why is that what she's making? What is informing what she's making?
It's a great question, and it was something that preoccupied me quite a bit during the research and lead up to the exhibition, because there are these relatively distinct styles that she pursues. She has the abstract all over canvases that I mentioned, pieces like Milky Way, but there's also a large part of her practice that is representational scenes of figures, often in these kind of floral or forested surrounds that are much more what we might call like Chagall inspired, and in some cases seem to be scenes from Ukraine or like from the old country in the dress and the style of like clothing that people have. And I really wondered for a long time whether it is the case that she moved from one to the other. I mean, that's sort of the narrative that...
You mean linearly?
Yeah, exactly.
Chronologically.
Correct, chronologically. Or is it that she was practicing those two styles, shall we say, at the same time? And in digging more into the exhibition history of what she showed when, which is in a way like the best the best way for her, since she almost never, in fact, I don't know if I've ever seen a painting that she dated. She signed some, but dated. I don't think I've seen anything that she dated. So really that exhibition history is the best way of reconstructing what was shown when, and sort of by extension, what was made when and in what order things were made. And so it did seem, as I pieced through all of that and put it all together, that she does start with these sort of Chagall-y, like, I'm doing air quotes for the podcast, these sort of naive representational scenes of figures in a landscape, and then moves through a really like kind of self-directed process into something that is more and more abstract and more all over, by which I mean paying equal amounts of attention to the edges and the corners of a composition as she does to the center. So in those great big all over abstract paintings, the kind of reason for that name in the title is that there's a sort of lavishing of attention all over the canvas.
So that's where we're going to go. But before we get there, the thing that holds true throughout the oeuvre is that she's using every inch of the rectangle. So in these early works where there are faces surrounded by foliage, the compositions are covering the entire rectangle. And even when she goes her most abstract, that is also happening, sometimes with, sometimes not with faces. If we stay in the early 1940s for a moment, why is she using in paintings that reference at least, the neck up part of the figure, every inch of the canvas? Why do we think that is attractive and useful to her?
I think one reason, or one kind of way to understand that, it's a great question, because even in early works like Disappointment from around 1943, which is a major early canvas of hers that's exhibited quite a lot after it's made, there is this like figurative but all overness to it. And to me, it sort of seems to connect to her intensely creative urge. I mean, from everything that I've read and having spoken to family, that there was this sort of irrepressible creative energy that she had. And so I see that perhaps in a way as connected to the, even quite early on, the all-overness. And we know, too, that she, there are, of course, paintings on board and canvas, there's drawings on paper in the show, but she also made art, even in the early 40s moment, on much more unconventional supports, so things like seashells and bolts of velvet and book covers and tiles and ceramics. So there's a kind of intensity to the creative act that, in a way, applies to everything that she's touching, even from the early 1940s period when she just starts.
All over is not our phrase. All over is the phrase from the period, from the 1940s and 50s, when there begins to be written in the press critical response to her work. And it is first celebrated for this all-overness, for the, with one exception, or maybe two, male critics. The thing that is noteworthy about the work is its all-overness. In the context of the 1940s and 1950s, why was all-overness so important?
I mean, I think it's so interesting to note, as you say, that all over is being described, is a term being used to describe her paintings as early as 1944 in that solo show at the Puma Gallery. And there is in her, at least in some of the reviews that I've read of her work, and with other artists too, there was a kind of danger of tipping from this kind of heroic all-overness into something that is decorative or like wallpaper.
So the danger was becoming decorative.
Right.
So this is, so how does, we're going to come back to the decorative, but how does
Why
is that a danger?
Why is that a danger? I mean, it's a danger because then it sort of loses the masculinist verve, I would say, right? But is there are you sort of getting into Clement Greenberg with this?
No, I'm trying to avoid
Okay.
Clement Greenberg. I would more of my life like to avoid Clement Greenberg. If we think of the decorative tradition, I at least first think of French painting, which has a rich decorative tradition going back through, Puvis and Vuillard and Bonnard and Matisse. There's a great decorative Matisse up at the MFA here in Houston right now on loan from a private collection. Decoration is core and really important to the French tradition, and French modernism carries it forward, not Picasso. So is this all-overness without being decorative also a celebration of the American, that we are not decorative the way those French painters, those decadent, decorative French painters are? Is there a nationalism within that?
Sure, I think that becomes part of the, staking out the terrain of abstract expressionism, and as the center of the art world shifts after the Second World War to New York, and there becomes a need, a sort of rhetorical desire to establish what is American painting. And this is when, certain artists are marshaled for that and certain are not. That's bound up in the kind of making it an American, a great American painting tradition.
So this is maybe the most interesting thing to me about the response to Sobel's work in the 40s and 50s. It's American and not within a French decorative tradition. It's all over, which is distinctly American, and this is a painter who lives in Brighton Beach and who is Ukrainian and Jewish. So how does the American art firmament, critical, museum, galleries, reconcile those two things?
I mean, I think for me it goes back to the kind of calcification that we were talking about, that in the 40s, in the moment of its emergence, it's much sort of looser in a way. And it is, I want to emphasize, remarked on even in that mid-40s moment when Sobel has her exhibitions and makes this sort of splashy entrance into the art world, the very small art world that was New York in those years. It is certainly remarked upon that she is carries an unusual biography, and that she is in many ways a kind of unusual figure to be making these paintings. The critics at the time talk about how, and often quite dismissively, there's a tone of this grandma in Brighton Beach is making these paintings, how odd and how unusual. So that unusual biography, self-taught, an immigrant, a woman, is all
part of it. Can I interrupt for just a sec?
Yeah.
When the critics are talking about her as living in Brighton Beach, is that a geographical identifier, or is that code for something else?
I think it's also code for Jewish at that time. So all of that is flagged, I would say, and a point of, kind of, I don't know, sometimes remarked upon with bemusement and then going into much more dismissive tones, but that is certainly part of and talked about even in the period when she emerges. But then, as we've been talking about, it's more when the narratives begin to be sort of set out and formalized and calcified and concretized that there's a kind of culling that happens.
So there's, in the textual response to her work, I think a real tension that you can read between how to talk about this painter's work in the context of the new American contemporary art project, even though she's Ukrainian, even though she's Jewish in an atheistic but vaguely Protestant New York art world, which brings us to kind of the other two terms used to describe her work right of way. first, the relationship between her work and surrealism, which is a willingness to welcome Europe into the American tradition. How might we understand Sobel's work as engaging, extending surrealism? Because I think it's more understandable in the context of the art world of her time than from now looking back.
There's a radio interview that Sobel does in 1945 that we have the transcript from. I think it's from there. And she is asked about sort of the question of belonging to a school or a movement or a group of artists, or how she sort of sees herself, where she places herself in the various lineages and schools that have emerged in this mid-40s moment. And she says, I'm a I think she might even say, of course I'm a surrealist. But even if it's not an of course, I am a surrealist, I paint what I feel. And so I think by the time surrealism comes to the United States, it's 20 years after the movement is launched in Paris. It's a kind of regathering of the artists from France, from Europe, who had been able to flee and come and recollect themselves and sort of re-establish the movement in a way in New York. And so it's quite far removed. And I think that the fact that she talks about painting what she feels, for her, that must have sort of been a legibly surrealist action. And we also know that she was in touch with some surrealist artists. So Max Ernst is someone that she knew. He was living in New York in that early 40s moment. And one of the first artworks, one of the first drawings that she makes is a drawing that is done on the kind of copyright page of a Salvador Dali brochure that's published by the Museum of Modern Art in 1941 to accompany this Salvador Dali exhibition there. So these are at least two artists that she has access to in a way, one through exhibitions and seeing his art at the museum, and one through personal connections. I think he went over to the house and had dinner once. And so that, I think, goes some distance in helping us understand the surrealistness of it. It's partly about the sort of personal resonance and exploration that she's doing on the canvas, and it's also an association that she's extending to these artists that she is in contact with or aware of, at least.
Is surrealism's interest in the subconscious being found within her work in her own time?
I would say that there is a sort of switch that happens within her own time, actually. So when she has her first solo exhibition in 1944, that is more of the work. What is shown is more of the work that we would think of as the early things, like narrative, figural paintings of people in landscapes. And she is described as a primitive, meaning a lot of things, but in part self-taught. And by the time she has her second solo show in 1946, it's barely 2 years later, she has moved on in a way to making these much more abstract compositions that are produced in a way that the surrealists would have called automatically, which we can get into. But even in the literature, that kind of evolution or flip-flop is noted. There's a review, I think it's in the New Yorker, that calls her a primitive gone modern. And so there's another, I think it's in the 1946 Peggy Guggenheim catalog essay, where the author writes that she started as a primitive but is now a surrealist. So there's a kind of like moving her from one association or school to the other. And that's the other just thinking about automatic, that's the other kind of real connection to surrealism that I just wanted to mention, is that one of the ways that Sobel made her work is by dripping paint onto the surface of the canvas, a horizontally positioned canvas, and dripping it from above. And while this is now something that we think of very much as a like abstract expressionist Jackson Pollock-y gesture, I think it was also very available to be claimed by the surrealists who were interested in automatic procedures, which is to say, making art without the intervention or the control of your kind of conscious mind. So things like automatic drawing, automatic writing.
I think it's crucial to note that this is the moment. Let me do that differently. I think it's really important that the relationship between surrealism and emergent United States abstraction is being figured out in this moment in real time. So in 1937, MoMA launches, in one of its first major exhibitions, a 700-object presentation of surrealism. A show which, if you can go back and look at the show on MoMA's Exhibition Archive website, which is one of the great resources on the art internet. And to look at that show is to see an institution trying to figure out what this thing is. In real time. In 1944, just 7 years later, Sidney Janis does a show and writes a book titled Abstract and Surrealist Art in America, the title itself suggesting that this is a definition and a relationship in flux and being figured out. So for me, that Sobel's work is kind of being discussed between these two terms is an including of her in a discourse in a certain relevant way. Also important here is the word you just brought up, the word primitive. Maybe without talking about Sobel's work quite yet, how is it understood in the 30s and 40s, the relationship of the primitive to surrealism?
The surrealists were very interested in, I'll back up. The surrealists, as part of their interest in ways of making art that bypasses conscious thought, were very interested in the work of people who were in many ways non-artists, so that non-artists as traditionally sort of considered. And so that extended to being interested in the art made by children, interest in the art of people who were insane, as they called it, and also interested in self-taught artists.
All of whom were in that MoMA show in 37.
Yeah. And so it's funny in a way that there's this switching that happens as regards to Sobel. She was a primitive artist, now she's a surrealist, because I think for the surrealist kind of classically thinking about it, surrealism was very interested in primitivism, as it was called then, and could sort of like include it in a way.
You mentioned dripping. Let's talk about how Sobel makes paintings. So in the early 40s, particularly those works with, say, the faces and the foliage, how is she making those paintings?
I will preface this by saying that there's a lot we don't know about the way that Sobel actually made her paintings, the way that she made her art. There is a famous photograph that exists that if you Google Sobel is the image that comes up of her lying on the floor in her apartment surrounded by canvases. Using a kind of brush or instrument to apply paint. So we have this photograph, which I think was a staged photograph, although could still be representative of the way that she works. But we don't have other photographs of her in the studio. There isn't like a film of her dripping paint the way there is for some other artists. We also don't have, that I have found at least, journals or notebooks where she described that. So just preface it in that way. But that being said, I think that sort of visually, and having looked at the paintings with our paintings conservators, that she does move from making painting that is like sort of a painting that is in front of her, that is vertically oriented, to making paintings that are composed on the horizontal, to works that she is dripping paint on and then is picking up the canvas or the board and physically tipping it or manipulating it to move paint around the canvas. We also know that she would sometimes pick up ordinary household implements and use them as a kind of stamp or a tool to further manipulate the painting. There's a work in the galleries that I'm thinking of in particular that has these sort of scooped, ridged forms printed on it in a way. And there's also stories that I have heard and heard both sides of that, yes, it did happen, no, it didn't, that she used a vacuum cleaner as a way to like move the paint, the still wet paint, mind you, around the canvas. I don't know if we've been able to like affirmatively test that a vacuum cleaner was used in the making of those paintings,
you just launched a conservator's master's project. Do we know why she started dropping or dripping paint onto a support from above?
I don't know that we know that.
Do you have a guess? Could she have been engaging with ideas of the subconscious, or was she just, in the way that painters do on a Thursday afternoon, while hanging around with stuff, thought, hey, see how this goes?
I think it could have been that. I will also say that I think there were a number of artists in New York in that early 30s moment that are sort of just experimenting in general with different, new, fun ways to put paint on a canvas.
Clifford still is not using brushes, he's just using a palette knife.
And
he's not in New York until 44, but yeah.
Max Ernst, when he comes over from France, talks about having developed a technique that he called oscillation, which involved filling a tin can with paint and poking a hole in the bottom of the can and oscillating it, like holding it suspended over a canvas and like making circles with it or moving it around in these sort of ellipses. And that was a way of creating line, like getting line onto a canvas, again, automatically in that sense. There's a painting down the hall from us here that has the oscillation technique in the Surrealism Gallery. So it's like this is a very fertile environment with lots of cross-pollination happening where the Surrealists have arrived in New York and the young abstract expressionists or the young New York artists that will eventually be called the abstract expressionists. It's all a kind of small art world that's a big mix of a lot of different people.
In which you feel like you can try something different,
Yeah.
no matter who you are or where you're working. So Sobel is sometimes dripping paint onto canvases, and sometimes those paintings that appear to have drips on them, such as Heavenly Symphony from around 47, a painting now at Crystal Bridges, or Milky Way, which is what, 45 or 46? 45. At MoMA appears to have elements that are dripped from above. Sometimes those works have faces in them. Is she also dripping the faces?
Ooh, good question. I don't know if I think that there are some faces that are dripped in a way, but some that are more painted on. Like if you think of there's an earlier work called The Burning Bush, which is at LACMA now
44.
from 1944. Yeah, and that one has some faces that, as happens so often in her work, these faces that kind of seem to appear and then and then recede into this very densely constructed background. And in that case, the faces are created with the same kind of curlicue, comma-like marks that she used to create the rest.
Small, tight marks.
Yeah, that she used to create the rest of the scene. So there's that kind of face. But then in Heavenly Sympathy, which is a later work than this one, a later work than The Burning Bush, I mean, there's an extraordinary array of mark making that's going on in that painting. I think there is dripping, but also holding a brush and applying marks that's going on. And she's also, I think, tipping and lifting the composite, like the surface, the support itself to manipulate the surface. So there's a lot going on at sort of the later we get, I think.
It's fascinating to me that she was mixing, maybe mixing is a bad word, that she was doing on a single support very, very abstract stuff, and also faces, which are the exact opposite of that. A, do you have a theory on why she's mixing the two? And B, how is it received that both are there in the same work?
I've thought about this a lot because it's a remarkable and recurrent feature of a lot of her work. And I think that one answer might be that including faces or facial eyes, sometimes just eyes, but sometimes faces, sometimes, more of the human body, is a kind of like humanist expression for her, like a way of getting the human into the painting. And she was asked to, I think this is also in 1945, she was asked to contribute a artist statement to the show A Painting Prophecy that was held at the David Porter Gallery in Washington, D.C. And her statement was just one sentence, very different from like the Rothko and Pollock and whoever else statements. And she just wrote, "I am intensely interested in people and everything that pertains to them," which is pretty great. And then to the question of how that like interweaving of abstraction and figuration is received, I would say that it's not too commented on, in part because it's, at least the paintings that we have here, like Heavenly Sympathy and Hiroshima, and many of the drawings in which that aspect of her practice is so apparent, a lot of that work comes after she has left New York. And so she is not having the same kind of critical reviews or engagement that she'd been having before.
We should note she did not move to Canada. She moved to...
Indeed. New Jersey.
Yeah, 45 minutes away. So
Right.
it's not like she just
Crucially,
totally...
yes.
The scale at which she's working is not the scale for which we know the most self-consciously heroic of Abek's works. What do we know about the scale at which she chose to work? And do you think that the scale at which she working was widely remarked upon and considered at the time?
I don't think it's something that, as far as I remember, it's not something that's widely remarked upon at the time.
I couldn't find it either. I looked.
Yeah. And there are some quite large paintings, Heavenly Sympathy and Hiroshima and others, but
good
they're
size,
large, but they aren't
but they're understandable
monumental.
within human, the size of the human body, whereas, Clifford Still is
Sure.
trying to destroy us.
Sure. I think that, a few things. I think one is that, is this right? I think that part of it is that as she is becoming a more experienced painter, that also coincides with when the allergy that she develops to paint becomes more and more problematic.
In around 1948?
Like 47 or so. I was talking with someone today. So anyway, in 1947, to back up, in 1947, right before Sobel and the family moved to Plainfield, New Jersey, just an hour from New York, same distance as they were before in Brighton Beach, but just on the other side. there is an article that's published in the Brooklyn Eagle in 1946 that describes the painter, that describes her having developed an allergy to, quote, something in the paint that she uses. And it does seem that after this move, her painting production slows, but doesn't stop entirely. And in a way that's already signaled in this article that says that she's developed this allergy, it goes on to immediately state it's a really big problem for her because she can't leave painting alone even when she tries. So she seems to be slowing down but not stopping entirely. But to get back to the question about size and scale, I think that might be one reason why they don't get ever bigger and bigger, because it's true also that when she moves to New Jersey, she's in a huge house. So there's some limitations of the studio, but it's not like she's working in an apartment anymore either.
Picasso paints bigger when he goes out to the suburbs. I mean, it's not just an American thing.
Right. But interestingly, there's one of the first exhibitions that sort of recovers Sobel to the historical narrative in a way is a show in the 1980s called Abstract Expressionism, Other Dimensions. I think that's what it's called. That looks specifically at smaller work, sort of against the mural-sized lavender mists of the time. So it's interesting that and that's a show that puts Sobel back on the walls, with much of the work loaned by the family at that point. But anyway, it's interesting that this size and scale question, it might not be remarked upon in the 40s, but by the time we get to the 80s, there are these other sort of, approaching abex and abstraction from other, taking other angles of approach, that's a feature. That's
Milky Way and de Kooning's Women are not significantly differently sized paintings, right? We have not talked about subject matter at all beyond we see abstraction, we see faces. And so I wanted to talk about subjects and perhaps the relationship of subjects to some titles. There aren't just faces in a lot of these works. These are faces with specific expressions, and I might describe them as kind of dolorous faces more than any other emotion. Do you see them as having a dolorous visage, and what might we take or understand from that?
Well, in speaking with some of Sobel's family, I've heard from them that a number of the faces for them really function as portraits too. So they're specific people, or possibly specific people that she knew or remembered from a long time ago that she is painting in. So it's not, in some cases, just eyes because it's a kind of interesting compositional artistic choice, but that they are really meant to refer to specific individuals. So that's one thing. What was the other question?
No, that was it. That was good. There's a painting that is presently unlocated that I think is maybe a really good way for beginning to talk about whether these paintings have, or Sobel thought of them as having subjects. And that painting is from 1944. It's called Music. It survives in color reproductions, and it was maybe the best known of her paintings in the mid-1940s. It was at least the cover of one of the Sidney Janis catalogs.
For
brochures.
That surrealism.
Yeah.
Surrealism and abstraction. Surrealist and abstract art in America.
show.
Yeah.
So Music, 1944, what is it about?
This is a painting that Sobel describes having made when she was listening to the radio and was listening to...
Shostakovich.
Yes, and was listening to Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, the Leningrad. And so already with that, there is a sort of specific relationship that she is establishing to world events and to the war. And that account, interestingly, enters the world sort of with the painting, so that the painting is reproduced in color in the Sidney Janis book, and he prints a little, few sentence account from Sobel about that, the sort of story of the origin of this painting and what she was listening to. So that association between an abstract painting and a subject is already there from the very beginning. I will also add that the painting joins the show abstract and surrealist art in the United States. It's included in that exhibition, which travels around the United States from Chicago to, I think, Denver, and then it goes down the West Coast. And the first painting that Sobel has in that show is called Devotion of the Spirits, which was a painting on glass that broke in transit from one city to another. And so Sobel sent music in very early 1944, so I think it must have just been completed, sends music where it joins the exhibition, possibly for its second to last showing, or at least for its very last showing at what is now the SF MoMA, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. So it also has this interesting story, and that's, I think, one way, too, that we know that music is one of the first real leaps into abstraction that she makes, because it's sent to the West Coast, to San Francisco. I think I don't want to say the month, but it's quite early in the year, in 44.
If we think of music as being at least related to Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, which is about the siege of Leningrad, the Nazis, Stalin's butchery, Shostakovich's response to all that. Clifford Still's earliest abstract expressionist paintings from 42 and 43 are very much responses to his experiences working in the East Bay shipyards as a steel supervisor, which was wild, because before Still was a steel supervisor, he had zero experience with steel. Opens up a whole different way of thinking about early abstract expressionism and its relationship to the war. Mm-hmm. Milky Way, 1945, the first painting of Sobel's that the Museum of Modern Art in New York acquires. MoMA exhibits it quite quickly in a recent acquisition show, and then does not show it again until, checks notes, an Art of the 40s installation in 1991, and then somehow manages to include it in the museum's other Sobel from its 2010-2011 ABEX New York show, which is wild. There was lots of work in that show that had nothing to do with New York as well, and yet Sobel working in New York is not included. Just things that amaze me. What is the Milky Way about?
Well, the Milky Way is a scene that to me has always seemed like a very underwater scene rather than a celestial scene necessarily. But it's one of her most incredible all-over abstract canvases with, again, as we were just talking about, this incredible variety of mark making. And this one, interestingly, we do know a bit more about, because when it entered MoMA's collection in 1968, it had entered just as Janet Sobel herself died. But her son, Saul, who had been one of her great advocates from the very beginning, filled out an artist questionnaire that MoMA sends to artists when work is acquired by the museum. And one of the questions is something about, like, how was this made, or any remarks about the technique or materiality or whatever. And in that little questionnaire, Saul talks about her dripping paint from a height onto the horizontally positioned support. He also talks about how she would sort of move it around. I don't think she says that it's a vacuum cleaner, but nevertheless that she's moving and manipulating the paint, the still wet paint, around. And he says, he has this great anecdote that you couldn't get too close to her while she was working, or she would like grab hold of your shirt sleeve and use it to kind of smear the paint around, which is pretty amazing.
That's cinematic.
Yeah. So that's a painting that, because of that, because it enters the museum early enough when, there's just one generation of remove, we do know a little bit more about. And similarly, this isn't a painting that we had talked about so far, but her first ever museum acquisition actually comes in 1945 when the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts acquires the painting Invasion Day, also from 1944, like with music. And there, too, there's a little questionnaire that she fills out this time that's at the museum, where she talks about painting this work. Here she doesn't talk about the methodology, she talks really about the subject matter. And she says that she painted this just before the invasion, and that the air was sort of filled with tension. But it's an amazing, one of these like sort of in-betweeny works that has curlicue, very tightly made marks like the burning bush, but also this giant eye in the middle of the canvas.
Is the burning bush about the biblical story?
I think so. I don't think there's another kind of clue to what it would be about. Yeah, and she did make paintings. I mean, often she used her titles as a kind of signal, and so there are other paintings that she made about the war, for instance. So there's Invasion Day that I just mentioned, and Music, which we know was made sort of in that context and in response to this musical symphony that's very much about the war. There's also paintings like Hiroshima. She also made
From
one
about
titled
1948.
And there's another one titled Nagasaki. There's one called Hitler's Hell. These are titles that we know at least are contemporary to the works because they're published in the exhibition brochures when she shows them. So that kind of like subject matter of the world coming into the studio is very present.
Hiroshima is one of the most interesting paintings in the show. How does she present, and she's making it in 48, so several years after.
Like circa 48.
Yeah, circa 48.
So we don't really know.
So it's not a painting of a bomb. Mm-hmm. What is it a painting of? What does it tell us about how she's thinking through a cataclysmic event?
Mm-hmm. It is, I'm trying to conjure it in my mind. It's a painting that has this whole sort of variety of abstract marks that she concentrates really in the bottom half or 2/3 of the canvas, and then the top of the scene has this very large, kind of enormous face that's rising seemingly from this mass of more or less abstract marks below.
So for her, the event is about people. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing that comes thundering through that painting. Like every time I look at that painting, my eye always goes back to the face, which I think is really important.
And that painting is exhibited in 1962 in her last known solo show in Plainfield, New Jersey, but it's also exhibited at an earlier solo show in 1957, which we don't have a exhibition brochure for, so it's like barely survived, but I found our reference to it in the archives of the Plainfield Courier News, like the little local paper in New Jersey. So there's this 1957 show that includes Hiroshima, and the author of that story really talks about that painting and describes this sort of looming face of God the Father, as he puts it, that's coming out of the destruction.
Oh.
Yeah.
When you see that face, do you think God the Father?
I don't know.
Wow. Let's open it up to questions. I believe there's a microphone. If you have a question,
raise your hand,
and you will be accommodated.
Hi, thank you both so much for this conversation. I wanted to pick up on a theme you were both discussing, and especially Tyler mentioned, which was, what would it mean for, a burgeoning abstract expressionism to directly engage with the events of World War II? And in response to your question about the burning bush, I think that could be a painting about liberation and freedom. The burning bush sort of telling Moses that he had to lead the Jewish people to Israel. So, at the time of concentration camps and things like that, it could be a hopeful painting that there will be this kind of future freedom. So I guess that's not a question, and I'm sorry for that, but I've really appreciated the conversation and bringing these kinds of threads together, because I think we don't often think of abstract expressionism as being about anything, but of course it has like this major historical context, so I'm grateful that you've illuminated it.
Are there any other World War II elements you find in the paintings as you go through? I mean, some of the titles are pretty direct.
Mm-hmm. I mean, for me, the titles are really doing the most signaling and the most tethering to current events that she might have read about in the newspaper or listened to on the radio, because she listened to the radio all the time. So that's what I would say. Oh, although one thing to maybe add is that there also is a large number of works that are more representational scenes of canvases. Sorry, I'll start again for the podcast. There is a large number of works, many of them works on paper, that are more representational scenes of cannons and soldiers and people with guns. So that's a kind of different way that she engaged with current events and what was going on in the world. And we focused more on, the abstract story in this exhibition, but there's certainly sort of a different way that she was processing those things at or around the same time too.
Hello, thank you for this talk tonight. I am a Sobel novice, and upon seeing the exhibition, I did delight in the use of crayon as part of one of the ways that she was expressing herself, and I'd just love to hear more about, or if she ever talked about the use of those types of mediums that are usually relegated to an elementary classroom, but we kind of reclaimed it for modern art, so I'd like to hear more about that.
Yeah, so, and we mentioned earlier how difficult it is to assign super certain dates to many works. Some things we know because they're exhibited in a given year, like music, shown in early 44, so we sort of have that date for it. The drawings, that is very much the case, but from the historical evidence and from having spoken to family members and so on, the real thinking is that those are works that she, on the whole, makes after the New York chapter. So Sobel and the family moved to New Jersey in 1947. She's had this allergy to paint that is not stopping her from painting altogether. As we talked about, Hiroshima is a circa 48 painting, so she's not giving it up entirely, but it does seem to be that is when the works on paper and the use of crayon really come to the fore more. And I agree, I think those works are amazing and have been really interesting to me to think about how that kind of patterning and repetition of shape and certain forms like flowers or eyes that recur, how that can be understood as another kind of all-overness, or even another kind of like abstract mark making. That's not this sort of, a kind of abstract mark making that's not paints swirled and like smooshed and dripped and arranged in this like fabulous concatenation of paint, but how the crayon marks can kind of create a different type of abstraction. The other thing I wanted to add about 1947, this very important year where she moves to New Jersey, the allergy that she has to something in the paint that she's using kind of comes to the fore and is written about at the time. The other major event that does a lot, I think, in shaping what happens to her after the New Jersey move — New Jersey is, after all, not all that far from Manhattan — is that Peggy Guggenheim closes her art gallery and moves to Venice, Italy. And so with that, Sobel loses the gallerist, the dealer, who's really become her major champion over the last year and a half or so. So that is another, that I think is a good explanation, or goes some distance to understanding why this move to New Jersey, not all that far, why it happens that she doesn't have another solo show or even another group show in New York after that. I think the Peggy departure is really the turning point for her.
The other thing that I should have asked about but did not, that you helpfully raise, is Sobel was experimenting with media. She uses sand. This is a time when other painters are, like Clifford Still, making their own paints, mixing their own pigments, are using glass and sand and mirrors and stuff. And so that's another way in which she's within an artistic mainstream in a way that maybe we don't, including me, foreground maybe as much as we might.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned that painting, Devotion of the Spirits, that is broken on the tour of abstract and surrealist art in the United States, because it is a painting on glass. So she does paintings on glass, as well as the more traditional artistic media.
And Pollock later faux makes a painting on glass for Hans Nemeth, right?
Right. So, and yes, is using sand in early paintings, already like 1943. That is a more sort of folk, naive, representational scene of a figure in a landscape, but she really thickens her material, thickens her media with sand, and uses it in a very interesting way to kind of make her signature. It's a full signature, Janet Sobel, the whole thing, and it really like stands up on the canvas. So there's a real whole angle of how experimental she is with her methods of paint application, but also with the materials that she is using and the supports that she's using.
And the European avant-garde had used sand in paintings in
Sure.
France 20 years earlier. Anyway, sorry.
So I know you've done some conservation work and study on these paintings. And looking at something like Burning Bush, it seems like, besides being applied or dripped, there's like this gouging or impressioning, using something to scratch or things like that. Are you recognizing that kind of action in what she was doing?
I don't know that LACMA has done like a whole big analysis of the Burning Bush, but yeah, I definitely see that kind of gouging and like going into the paint, not just applying on top, not just additive all the time, certainly.
Natalie Dupêcher, thanks very much.
Thank you.